The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Marcus Thompson adjusted. His red tunic and tall black bearskin hat. At 28 years old, he had worked incredibly hard to earn his position as one of the Queen's guards. The crisp autumn air filled his lungs as he took his post outside the palace gates. Standing perfectly still with his rifle at his side, Marcus had dreamed of this moment since he was a young boy growing up in Birmingham. His grandmother used to tell him stories about the brave soldiers who protected the royal family. He would march around their small apartment pretending to be one of them. Now, after years of rigorous training and dedication, he was living that dream. The tourists began gathering early, as they always did. Cameras clicked constantly as visitors from around the world tried to get the perfect photo with the stoic guards. Marcus had learned to ignore the noise, the questions, and even the occasional person who tried to make him laugh or break his composure. He remained motionless, his dark eyes focused straight ahead, hiding the discipline and honor of his position. As the morning progressed, a steady stream of people passed by. Families with excited children, elderly couples on holiday, and young backpackers all stopped to admire the famous guards. Marcus could hear their whispered conversations and see their pointing fingers in his peripheral vision, but he remained as still as a statue. Around midday, a black taxi pulled up to the curb near the palace gates. An elderly white man stepped out, wearing an expensive-looking navy suit and carrying a walking stick with a silver handle. His gray hair was perfectly styled, and his posture suggested someone who was used to commanding respect. The man paid the taxi driver and walked slowly toward the palace entrance, his sharp blue eyes scanning the area with obvious familiarity. Colonel James Whitfield, now 72 years old, had once been a high-ranking officer in the British Army. He had served for over 30 years before retiring. With full honors and a comfortable pension, despite his retirement, he still carried himself with military bearing and expected others to show him the same deference he had grown accustomed to during his service years. As Whitfield approached the palace gates, his eyes fell upon Marcus standing guard. For a moment, something flickered across his weathered features, a look that Marcus had unfortunately become familiar with over the years. It was a look that questioned whether someone like him belonged. In such a prestigious position, the retired colonel stopped walking and stood directly in front of Marcus, studying him with undisguised scrutiny. The tourists around them began to take notice, some lowering their cameras to watch what was unfolding. Whitfield tapped his walking stick against the pavement twice, the sharp sound echoing off the palace walls. Whitfield called out in a loud, an authoritative voice that was clearly meant to draw attention. "Is this really what Her Majesty's Guard has come to these days?" Marcus felt his jaw tighten slightly, but his training kicked in. He had been prepared for moments like this. The instructors had warned all the guards that they might face discrimination or challenges to their authority, especially those who looked different from the traditional image people expected. He kept his eyes fixed straight ahead and maintained his perfect posture. Several tourists had stopped their activities completely now, sensing that something significant was happening. Some held their phones ready, unsure whether they should start recording. The atmosphere around the palace gates had shifted from the usual cheerful buzz of sightseeing to something more tense and uncomfortable. Whitfield stepped closer to Marcus. Close enough that his voice didn't need to carry far, but still loud enough for nearby observers to hear clearly. "In my day, the guard represented something dignified, something respectable. Standards meant something back then." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus could feel the eyes of dozens of people on him, waiting to see how he would respond. His heart rate remained steady, his breathing controlled. Years of training had prepared him for this exact moment, though he had hoped he would never have to face it. Behind his stoic expression, Marcus's mind was working quickly. He knew that any reaction, any break in his composure would be exactly what Whitfield was hoping for. The retired colonel seemed to be testing him, trying to provoke a response that would justify his obvious disapproval. The tension in the courtyard was becoming palpable. Other guards at their posts had noticed the commotion, though they remained at their positions as protocol demanded. Tourist groups had stopped their guided tours to observe what was happening. Even the palace staff who were visible in the background had paused there. Activities? Whitfield raised his walking stick and pointed it directly at Marcus, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you, soldier." But Marcus remained perfectly still, his training and inner strength serving as an unshakable foundation. He had worked too hard and come too far to let one bitter old man undermine everything he had achieved. The real test was just beginning. Both men seemed to understand that this confrontation was about much more than military protocol. The crowd around the palace gates had grown larger, drawn by the obvious tension between the retired colonel and the young guard. Whispers spread through the gathered tourists as they tried to understand what was happening. Some visitors looked uncomfortable, sensing the underlying prejudice in Whitfield's words, while others watched with curiosity. Marcus continued to stand perfectly still, his rifle held precisely at his side. Every muscle in his body remained controlled and disciplined, even as Whitfield's voice grew more demanding and insulting. The retired colonel seemed frustrated by Marcus's lack of response, which only made him more determined to provoke a reaction. "This is absolutely disgraceful," Whitfield announced loudly, turning slightly to address the crowd that had formed around them. "In my 30 years of service, I never thought I would see the day when standards would fall so low." The Queen's Guard used to mean something special. A middle-aged woman from Canada who had been taking photos with her family stepped forward slightly. "Excuse me, sir, but what exactly is your problem with this guard? He's doing his job perfectly." Whitfield turned to face her, his expression showing annoyance at being questioned. "Madam, I don't expect civilians to understand military matters. This is about maintaining the proper image and traditions of the British Armed Forces." "What traditions?" asked a young man with a German accent who had been part of a tour group. "The tradition of standing guard and protecting people?" "Because that's exactly what he's doing." The retired colonel's face began to redden slightly. He hadn't expected pushback from the tourists, assuming they would either support him or simply watch quietly. "The tradition of having guards who truly represent British values and heritage," he replied stiffly. Anne, an elderly black woman from London, who had been visiting the palace with her grandchildren, stepped closer to the group. Her voice was calm but firm. "Young man," she said, looking directly at Marcus, "my husband served in the Royal Navy for 25 years. He would be proud to see you standing there today." Marcus felt a small warmth in his chest at her words, though he maintained his perfect composure. The woman continued, now addressing Whitfield directly. "And you, sir, should be ashamed of yourself. This young man has earned his position through hard work and dedication, just like any other guard." Whitfield's walking stick tapped the ground impatiently. "With all due respect, madam, you don't understand the standards required for this position. I've served my country with distinction, and I know what it takes to maintain the honor of the British military. Then you should recognize honor when you see it," replied a tall man with an Irish accent, who had been quietly observing the situation. "That guard has shown more discipline and professionalism in the last 10 minutes than you've shown in your entire display here." The crowd was beginning to shift clearly against Whitfield, but the retired colonel seemed too invested in his confrontation to back down. He turned back to Marcus, his voice becoming more personal and cutting. "You think you can just stand there and ignore me? I've forgotten more about military service than you'll ever learn. Where did you even come from? What makes you think you deserve to wear that uniform?" A family from Australia had been recording parts of the confrontation on their phone. The teenage daughter tugged on her father's sleeve. "Dad, this isn't right. That old man is being really mean for no reason." Her father nodded, then spoke up. "Sir, we came here to see the changing of the guard and learn about British traditions. This young man is representing your country beautifully. You're the one who's being disrespectful." Whitfield's frustration was becoming more obvious. He had expected to embarrass Marcus and perhaps force him to break protocol, but instead he was finding himself facing criticism from multiple directions. The tourists, who should have been neutral observers, were actively defending the guard he was trying to humiliate. "This is exactly what's wrong with the world today," Whitfield declared, his voice rising. "No one understands respect for authority anymore. No one appreciates the sacrifices that people like me have made to build and protect this nation, a young British woman who worked nearby and often walked past the palace during her lunch. Brake had stopped to watch the scene. She stepped forward, her voice clear and confident. Respect is earned, not demanded. And authority comes from how you use your position to help others, not to tear them down. The crowd murmured in agreement. Marcus could sense the support building around him, but he also knew that his real test was still ahead. Whitfield was becoming more desperate and angry, which meant he might become even more aggressive in his attempts to provoke a reaction. The retired colonel looked around at the faces surrounding him, seeing disapproval and disappointment instead of the support he had expected. His plan to humiliate the guard was backfiring spectacularly, but rather than retreating gracefully, he seemed determined to escalate the situation further. "Fine," Whitfield said, his voice taking on a more dangerous tone. "If you won't show me proper respect willingly, perhaps you need to be reminded of your place." The crowd tensed, sensing that the confrontation was about to reach a critical point. Whitfield raised his walking stick and moved even closer to Marcus, now standing just inches away from the guard's face. The crowd around them had grown silent, watching with a mixture of anticipation and concern. Several people had their phones out, ready to record whatever happened next. "I said, look at me when I'm addressing you," Whitfield shouted, his face now red with anger and embarrassment. "Do you think you're too good to acknowledge a superior officer?" Marcus remained perfectly still, his breathing steady and controlled. Behind his calm exterior, his mind was focused and alert. He had been trained for situations exactly like this one, though his instructors had always emphasized that the real test would come not from enemies on a battlefield, but from moments like this, when his character and professionalism would be challenged by people who should know better. The retired colonel seemed to interpret Marcus's continued silence as defiance, which only fueled his anger further. "This is what happens when standards are lowered," he announced to the crowd, though his words were now meeting obvious disapproval. "When political correctness becomes more important than actual qualifications." A woman from Scotland, who had been visiting London with her husband, stepped forward. "Sir, you're making a fool of yourself. That young man is showing more maturity and professionalism than you are." "You don't understand," Whitfield snapped back. "I've earned the right to expect proper respect. I've served my country for decades. I've made sacrifices that people like you could never understand." "And what about his service?" asked a man from Wales who had been watching quietly until now. "What about his sacrifice? He's out here every day in all kinds of weather, protecting people he doesn't even know." "That sounds like service to me." Whitfield turned back to Marcus, his frustration reaching a boiling point. "You think you can just ignore me? You think your little act of defiance makes you some kind of hero?" He raised his walking stick as if he might actually strike the guard. The crowd immediately reacted with gasps and concerned voices. "That's enough," called out several people simultaneously. The Australian father, who had been recording, stepped closer, ready to intervene physically if necessary, but Marcus remained unmoved, his training and inner strength serving as an unbreakable shield against Whitfield's aggression. He had prepared for this moment his entire life, not just through military training, but through every experience that had taught him who he was and what he stood for at that moment. A new voice cut through the tension. "Colonel Whitfield." Everyone turned to see a tall, distinguished man in his 60s walking toward them from the direction of the palace. He wore a perfectly pressed military uniform with several medals and insignia that indicated very high rank. His bearing and presence immediately commanded respect from everyone present, including Whitfield. The retired colonel's expression changed instantly from anger to surprise, then to something approaching fear. "General Morrison," he said, his voice suddenly much quieter. "Yes, James, it's been a while." General Morrison approached calmly, his eyes taking in the scene with the experienced assessment of a career military leader. "I was having a meeting inside when I heard there was some kind of disturbance out here. Imagine my surprise when I learned it involved you." The crowd had gone completely quiet now, sensing that they were about to witness something significant. Marcus maintained his position, but he could feel the shift in the atmosphere around him. General Morrison looked at Marcus with obvious approval. Guardsman Thompson, isn't it? He said. Yes, sir, Marcus replied, speaking for the first time since the confrontation began. His voice was clear and respectful. I've heard excellent reports about your service. Your commanding officers speak very highly of your professionalism and dedication. Thank you. Sir Marcus responded, still maintaining his perfect posture. The general then turned his attention to Whitfield, and his expression became considerably more serious. James, I'm disappointed. When I heard that a retired officer was causing problems out here, I hoped it wouldn't be someone I knew personally. Whitfield's face had gone pale. The confident, aggressive man who had been bullying Marcus just moments before now looked small and uncertain. Sir, I was just... I was concerned about standards. Standards. General Morrison's voice carried a tone of authority that made everyone present understand why he had reached such a high rank. Let me tell you about standards, James. Standards are about character, dedication, and service. They're about putting duty before personal comfort and country before self-interest. The general gestured toward Marcus. This young man embodies every standard we could hope for in a member of the Queen's Guard. He's shown remarkable discipline and professionalism, especially under circumstances that would have challenged anyone. Whitfield tried to speak, but General Morrison continued. What I witnessed here today was not a concern for standards. It was bullying, pure and simple. And it's beneath the dignity of anyone who has ever worn a British military uniform. The crowd around them was completely captivated, understanding that they were witnessing not just the resolution of a confrontation, but a powerful lesson in leadership and character. The Royal Guard Story Part 4, General Morrison stepped closer to Whitfield, his presence commanding absolute attention from everyone in the courtyard. The retired colonel, who had been so aggressive and confident just minutes before, now looked like a schoolchild who had been caught misbehaving. James, do you remember when we served together in Northern Ireland? The general asked, his voice carrying the weight of shared history. Do you remember the young soldiers who served under us? Men and women from all backgrounds, all colors, all walks of life? Whitfield nodded uncomfortably, clearly unsure where this was leading. And do you remember how we judged them? Not by where they came from or what they looked like, but by their courage, their dedication, their willingness to put their lives on the line for their fellow soldiers and their country. The general turned to address the crowd, speaking clearly enough for everyone to hear. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know something about Guardsman Thompson here. Last year, during a security incident at another royal residence, he helped save the lives of several civilians. He spotted suspicious behavior, followed protocol perfectly, and his quick thinking prevented what could have been a serious tragedy. Marcus felt a flush of pride at the recognition. Though he maintained his composure, he had never expected his actions that day to be discussed publicly. But he was grateful that General Morrison was sharing the story. This young man, the general continued, has also volunteered his time to work with underprivileged youth in London, teaching them about discipline, respect, and service. He's mentored young people who might otherwise have gone down the wrong path, showing them that there are better ways to find purpose and meaning in life. Several people in the crowd nodded approvingly, and Marcus could hear someone say quietly, "That's amazing." General Morrison then turned back to Whitfield, his expression becoming stern again. Now tell me, James, what exactly were you hoping to accomplish here today? What standards were you trying to uphold by bullying and attempting to humiliate one of our finest young soldiers? Whitfield's face had gone from pale to red again, but this time it was clearly embarrassment rather than anger. I was just... Things have changed so much since our day. Yes. They have changed, the general agreed. They've gotten better. We have more diversity, more opportunities for talented people from all backgrounds to serve their country. We have soldiers like Guardsman Thompson, who bring excellence and honor to every position they hold. A woman from the crowd called out, "Thank you for explaining this, General. We had no idea about the guard's background, but we could see he was handling himself with incredible professionalism." The general nodded to her. That's exactly right, madam. True professionalism means maintaining your standards and your dignity even when others try to tear you down. Even when facing prejudice or unfair treatment, Marcus felt deeply moved by the general's words and support. But he also felt something else: compassion for Whitfield. He could see that the retired colonel was now genuinely embarrassed and possibly beginning to understand the impact of his actions. General Morrison seemed to sense the same thing. "James, I've known you for many years. You were a good officer in your time, and you served with honor in some very difficult situations. But what happened here today is not who you used to be. This isn't the man I served alongside." Whitfield looked down at his walking stick, his shoulders sagging. I don't know what came over me. I've been feeling so... displaced lately. Like the world I understood doesn't exist anymore. The world you understood was never as simple as you thought it was, the general replied, but his tone had become more compassionate. There have always been outstanding soldiers from every background. You just weren't always in positions where you had to acknowledge it. The crowd was listening intently to this exchange, understanding that they were witnessing something deeper than just a resolution to a confrontation. They were seeing two older men grappling with questions of change, tradition, and what it really means to serve with honor. James, General Morrison continued, "You have a choice to make right now. You can continue down this path of bitterness and prejudice, or you can remember what you once stood for and find a way to be better." Whitfield slowly raised his head and looked directly at Marcus for the first time since the general had arrived. For several long seconds, the two men's eyes met. Marcus could see something changing in the older man's expression, recognition of the person rather than just the uniform. Perhaps an understanding of the dignity and strength that Marcus had. Displayed throughout the entire confrontation, Guardsman Thompson, Whitfield said quietly, his voice very different from the aggressive tone he had used earlier. "Yes, sir?" Marcus replied, still maintaining his perfect military bearing. Whitfield took a deep breath, and everyone in the courtyard seemed to lean in slightly, sensing that something important was about to happen. Guardsman Thompson Whitfield began again, his voice shaking slightly. The aggressive, demanding tone was completely gone, replaced by something much more human and vulnerable. "I owe you an apology." The courtyard was so quiet that everyone could hear every word clearly. Even the usual sounds of London traffic seemed muted, as dozens of people focused on this moment of truth. "I came here today carrying anger and frustration that had nothing to do with you," Whitfield continued, his eyes still locked on Marcus's. "I took out my own fears and prejudices on someone who didn't deserve it. Someone who has clearly earned his position through merit and dedication." Marcus maintained his military bearing, but those watching closely could see a slight softening in his expression. This was not what anyone had expected when the confrontation began. Whitfield took a step closer, but this time his approach felt respectful rather than threatening. "General Morrison is right. I was a different man once. I served alongside brave soldiers from every background imaginable, and I was proud to do so. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what really matters." An elderly tourist from France wiped away a tear. "This is beautiful," she whispered to her husband. "You showed remarkable discipline and professionalism today," Whitfield continued. "You maintained your dignity when I was trying my best to take it away from you. That takes a strength of character that I clearly lack." General Morrison watched the exchange with approval, but he remained silent. Understanding that this was something Whitfield needed to do on his own, "I want you to know," Whitfield said, his voice growing stronger and more sincere, "that I am genuinely sorry for my behavior. You represent everything good about military service, and I represented everything that can go wrong when someone forgets what service really means." Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm and measured. "Sir, I appreciate your apology. I know that facing our mistakes takes real courage." The crowd stirred at this response. Marcus had not only accepted the apology gracefully, but he had shown respect for the courage it had taken Whitfield to offer it. "You're a better man than I am," Whitfield said quietly. "And a better soldier than I was, even at my best." General Morrison stepped forward. "James, this is who you used to be. This is the officer I remember serving with. It's not too late to be that person again." Whitfield nodded, then did something that surprised everyone present. He straightened his posture, looked directly at Marcus, and gave him a proper military salute. "It has been an honor to meet you, Guardsman Thompson," Marcus, following protocol but also clearly moved by the gesture, returned the salute with perfect precision. The crowd broke into spontaneous applause. People were smiling, some were crying, and everyone seemed to understand that they had witnessed something remarkable. The tourists who had been recording on their phones now had a story that was far more meaningful than they had ever expected. The young German man from earlier called out, "That was incredible. You both showed what real honor looks like." The Scottish woman who had defended Marcus earlier approached Whitfield. "Sir, that took real courage. Thank you for showing us that people can change and grow." Whitfield turned to address the entire crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know that what you witnessed today was not just an apology. It was a lesson. A lesson about what happens when we let fear and prejudice cloud our judgment. What's possible when we find the courage to admit our mistakes." He paused, looking around at all the faces watching him. "This young man," he said, gesturing toward Marcus, "has shown you what true strength looks like. It's not about being the loudest or the most aggressive. It's about maintaining your principles and your dignity, especially when others are trying to tear you down." General Morrison smiled with obvious pride. "Gentlemen, this has been a reminder of why I've always been proud to serve in the British military. When we're at our best, we bring out the best in each other." A young British woman who had been watching from the beginning raised her hand. "Guardsman Thompson, can I just say that you've made me incredibly proud to be British today? The way you handled this situation was absolutely inspiring." Marcus allowed himself a small smile. "Thank you, ma'am. I was just doing my job." "No," said the Australian father, who had been ready to intervene earlier. "You were doing much more than your job. You were showing all of us how to handle adversity with grace and dignity." As the crowd began to disperse, many people approached both Marcus and Whitfield to shake their hands and expressed their admiration for how the situation had been resolved. The confrontation that had begun with hostility and prejudice had transformed into something beautiful and meaningful. As the crowd began to thin out and tourists returned to their sightseeing, General Morrison lingered with Marcus and Whitfield. The intensity of the confrontation had passed, replaced by a quieter, more reflective atmosphere. "Guardsman Thompson," the general said, "you've shown exceptional character today. Your commanding officers will hear about how professionally you handled this situation." "Thank you," Sir Marcus replied. "I was just remembering my training and trying to honor the uniform." Whitfield, who had been standing quietly nearby, spoke up. "If I may, General, I'd like to ask Guardsman Thompson something." Marcus and the general both looked at him with interest. "How did you do it?" Whitfield asked. "How did you maintain such composure when I was being so awful to you?" "I was trying my best to break your concentration, to make you react with anger or frustration." Marcus thought for a moment before answering. "Sir, my grandmother always told me that how others treat you says more about them than it does about you. She taught me that responding to hate with dignity is one of the most powerful things a person can do." "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman," Whitfield said softly. "She was." Marcus replied with a warm smile. "She passed away just before I got this position, but I carry her lessons with me every day." General Morrison nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of foundation that makes a great soldier. Character that comes from family, from values that run deeper than just military training." A few tourists were still lingering nearby, not wanting to miss any final words from this extraordinary encounter. The Australian family who had been recording earlier approached the group. "Excuse me," said the father. "Hope you don't mind, but we recorded parts of what happened here today. Would it be all right if we shared this story? I think people around the world could learn something from what we witnessed." Marcus looked uncertain, but General Morrison smiled. "I think that would be fine with Guardsman Thompson's permission. The world could use more examples of grace under pressure and the power of genuine apology." Marcus nodded his agreement. "If it helps people understand that we can all be better to each other, then yes, I'm comfortable with that." Whitfield stepped forward. I would like to add something, if I may. He turned to face the small camera on the phone. My name is James Whitfield, and I'm a retired British Army colonel. What you saw here today was me at my worst. Followed by this remarkable young man showing all of us how to be at our best. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I want people to know that prejudice and fear can poison anyone if we let them. I let my discomfort with change and my own insecurities turn me into someone I'm ashamed of. But I also want people to know that it's never too late to recognize our mistakes and try to do better. The Australian man lowered his phone. That's beautiful, sir. Thank you both. As the last of the tourists moved on, General Morrison prepared to return to his meetings inside the palace. Before leaving, he shook hands with both Marcus and Whitfield. James, he said to the retired colonel, I hope you'll stay in touch. Perhaps you'd be interested in volunteering with some of our youth programs. Someone with your experience, combined with the wisdom you've shown today, could make a real difference. Whitfield's eyes lit up with interest. I would like that very much, sir. And Guardsman Thompson, the general continued, keep setting the standard. The military needs more soldiers like you. After General Morrison had gone, Marcus and Whitfield stood together for a moment in comfortable silence. The morning's confrontation felt like it had happened in a different world. Guardsman Thompson, Whitfield said finally, I know this might sound strange after everything that happened, but would you be willing to have coffee with an old soldier sometime? I think I could learn quite a lot from talking with you. Marcus smiled genuinely. I would be honored, sir. I think we both have stories to share. 3 months later, Marcus was surprised to receive a letter at his base. It was from Whitfield, who had indeed begun volunteering with military youth programs. The letter described how he had been sharing the story of their encounter with young recruits. Using it as an example of how to handle conflict and prejudice with dignity, Dear Marcus, the letter read, I want you to know that our meeting that day changed my life. Not just because I was forced to confront my own prejudices, but because you showed me what real strength looks like. I've been working with young people from all backgrounds, and I tell them all about the guardsman who taught an old colonel what honor really means. The letter went on to describe how Whitfield had reconnected with his better self, and how he was working to make amends for years of allowing fear and prejudice to influence his thinking. Marcus folded the letter carefully and placed it in his locker next to a photo of his grandmother. He thought about how she would have smiled to know that, even in the most difficult moments, choosing dignity and grace could plant seeds that would grow into something beautiful. That evening, as Marcus walked through London after his shift, he reflected on how one difficult morning had led to such positive changes. The videos that tourists had shared online had indeed spread around the world, inspiring countless discussions about prejudice, dignity, and the power of sincere apology, most importantly to Marcus. The encounter had reminded him why he wore the uniform, not just to stand guard outside a palace, but to represent the best values of service, character, and resilience. His grandmother's lessons had guided him through his greatest test, and in doing so, had helped transform not just his own life, but the life of someone who had started as an adversary and had become unexpectedly a friend.